Volatility is compressing near the weekly 0.33 structural level inside a contained February range. The current week is not developing in open space. It is unfolding inside memory that formed earlier in February. The first weekly candle of February established a wide structural box. That box continues to define the active field of interaction. Price has not escaped it. The upper portion of that structure remains untouched this week. Instead, interaction continues near the mid-lower portion of the box, near the proportional symmetry level around 0.33. This level has repeatedly appeared as a structural reaction zone, not because of isolated price movement, but because proportional positioning has remained consistent across several weeks. The current weekly candle again closes near this region, not above it, not clearly below it, inside it. This is where duration becomes more important than movement. A single week touching a level does not define structural change. Persistence around that level begins to shape consequence. The February structure is still governing interaction, and the weekly candle remains inside its containment. The range itself is not narrow. It was originally formed with substantial volatility. Yet over time, internal activity has slowed. Movement continues. But relocation has not formed. This difference matters, because relocation requires more than temporary expansion. It requires persistence outside the boundary that previously defined containment. At the moment that persistence is absent, the weekly candle continues negotiating inside the February structural box. Interaction continues near the lower internal region, near the proportional symmetry level, and that location continues absorbing movement. This behavior often creates a visual contradiction. Movement appears active, but structural position remains unchanged. The chart shows activity. Structure shows containment. This is the tension now present inside the weekly environment. The market is not inactive, but it is not relocating either. Instead, volatility is being processed inside a previously established structural field. Duration inside this field continues to extend, and time is beginning to shape the environment more than movement. Because when persistence remains inside a boundary, the boundary gains structural weight. The longer price remains inside this February structure, the more significant that containment becomes, not as a prediction, but as a structural condition. Which means the question is not where price moves next. The question is whether interaction continues to remain inside this boundary long enough to reinforce it, or whether persistence eventually develops outside it. That process has not resolved yet. The weekly structure is still negotiating inside the February range, and duration continues to accumulate near the 0.33 region. From a structural perspective, the February range remains the dominant weekly boundary. The current week has not produced relocation outside that range. Instead, interaction continues around the lower internal band between approximately 0.25 and 0.33 of the structure. This proportional positioning matters because structural symmetry often redistributes volatility across these internal zones. Movement inside the box is not random. It tends to circulate between proportional levels before persistence emerges. At the moment, circulation continues, not relocation. The weekly chart also reveals another change developing quietly. The 120 moving average is beginning to flatten. Slope reduction is rarely dramatic. It develops slowly, but when it appears, it often signals that directional momentum is losing structural influence. The flattening of the 120 moving average suggests that longer duration movement is losing acceleration, not reversing, but slowing. Meanwhile, the weekly 20 moving average is approaching downward interaction with the 120. This interaction is important, not as a signal, but as a structural compression event. When a shorter moving average converges toward a flattening longer average, distance between them contracts. Distance contraction alters execution conditions, because distance defines tolerance. When averages compress, tolerance becomes narrower. Pullbacks reach deeper relative positions. Continuation attempts face greater friction. Small movements begin to feel structurally heavier. This is why average compression often produces behavioral hesitation, not because the market stops moving, but because structural distance shrinks. The chart reflects this. Weekly volatility has not disappeared, yet the environment feels constrained. Movements extend, then return. Attempts appear, then compress. This pattern is typical when structural slopes begin flattening. Momentum becomes inconsistent. Continuation attempts require more persistence, and internal rotation becomes more frequent. At the same time, the February range remains intact, which means the environment currently contains two simultaneous structural forces: range containment and slope compression. Neither has resolved yet. The market is not expanding freely, but it is also not fully stabilizing. Instead, interaction remains trapped between these forces. This is why weeks continue closing near the same structural zone, near the proportional symmetry region around 0.33. Not because the level is magical, but because the structural field surrounding it remains active. Duration inside that zone continues to grow. Each week that remains there adds structural memory. And structural memory changes how future interaction behaves, because repeated interaction increases structural density, and density changes volatility distribution. The February range continues holding. The moving averages continue compressing, and the weekly environment remains structurally unresolved. Volatility behavior also reflects this compression environment. The weekly 20 Bollinger Band continues maintaining a downward slope. This slope reflects the volatility expansion that occurred earlier in the structure, but the distance between the bands has not increased further. Instead, width is stabilizing. Stabilization of bandwidth often appears when expansion loses continuation. The environment shifts from expansion toward processing. Inside that processing state, the smaller timeframe volatility structures begin compressing first. And that behavior is visible in the weekly 4 Bollinger Band. The 4 Bollinger Band is contracting. Contraction of a shorter volatility band indicates that immediate movement is losing amplitude. Candles continue forming, but their range relative to recent volatility begins shrinking. This is another form of compression, not structural containment alone, but volatility contraction inside containment. Compression states often produce a behavioral paradox. Externally, the market still appears active, but internally, continuation attempts fail more frequently. Pullbacks deepen before stabilizing. Small fluctuations consume more time. Continuation attempts stall more quickly. This is how volatility compresses. Not through silence, but through repeated unfinished movement. And that is what the weekly chart currently reflects. Attempts appear, but duration does not extend. Movement occurs, but structural position remains unchanged. The February range continues containing the weekly environment. The proportional symmetry zone around 0.33 continues attracting interaction. The 120 moving average is flattening. The 20 moving average is converging toward it. The 20 Bollinger Band maintains a downward slope, and the 4 Bollinger Band continues contracting. Each of these conditions alters the structural environment, not by declaring direction, but by changing how execution conditions behave inside the structure. Compression environments tend to reduce tolerance. Distance expectations narrow. Failure frequency increases. Continuation requires greater persistence. And relocation attempts require longer duration to stabilize. These are behavioral consequences of compression, not predictions. The weekly structure therefore remains defined by containment and contraction. Movement continues. But relocation has not yet formed beyond the February boundary, which means the environment remains inside structural processing. And structural processing takes time. The weekly chart is still negotiating inside its established field. Environment is still processing.